I see a message that says now streaming live on Facebook.
Oh, that's great. Okay, I think it looks like we're live on Facebook. All right, thank you, Carrie. We'll miss you. Hey, I'm Lee Wright, the founder of History Camp, and with me is Will Nipper. Usually we have with us Carrie Lund, who's the executive director of the Pursuit of History, which is the organization behind History Camp. And unfortunately, we're having a few technical difficulties from Virginia. Everything here, though, is fine in outside of Boston. We're delighted you're with us. So Will is somebody that I think reached out to me. We started a little conversation in email. He was kind enough to send me this huge book, which is loaded with illustrations and photos and so forth. And when I saw that, I said, you've got to speak and come be a part of History Camp Online, and you need to also come be part of History Camp Live as soon as it starts. So Will, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. This is a topic. I mean, obviously everyone loves money, but this is really a fascinating topic. Let's start back at the beginning. So at one point there was this wonderful amalgam. There was the Dutch, the British, the French, the Spanish, Native Americans, different Indian tribes. In those earliest days, what was used for money, for trade?
Well, I think, it's pretty clear that the Native Americans had trade networks that date back thousands of years. We know that copper from Michigan got traded, is found in Virginia. We know that it was traded all over the place. And so we can't ignore that. The history of trade goes way, way back. But where we really start to see it pick up is when Europeans showed up with articles that maybe the Native Americans hadn't seen before. And those Europeans needed things for survival. And so it made sense for them to trade with the Native Americans. And of course, as we know, that didn't always work to the advantage of the Native Americans, but that's really how we think it got started. And some Europeans were better at it than others. Were better at developing relationships with the natives than others. The British at first were not very good at it. The French were pretty good at it. The French had the runners of the forest who would go out through the trapping and hunting, and they would develop strong relationships, and they would bring them things, bring the natives things that they needed, guns, traps, things like that were important to them. The British were it was more of a land consuming exercise, so they were not quite so good at it. The first, if you go back to the very first occurrence of money, and I know we'll get to that later, but the very first occurrence of it was, when the Dutch saw Iroquois with wearing beads or wampum, and they equated that, rightly or wrongly, they equated that with money. The Iroquois probably just regarded it as a symbol of respect, that someone was given beads, and the Dutch saw that and thought, well, they've got a lot of beads, they must be rich. And so that's kind of how it began to become a monetary thing. And the Dutch, when they ran out of food, tried to trade those beads to Englishmen in Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts folk bought it and declared wampum to be money, and that was really how it shifted over to money. But there was a lot of trade going on before that. Even in Arkansas, where I live, in the 1700s, it was said that gunpowder and musket balls were more valuable than gold or silver, because that meant survival. If you had that, bear grease, anything of value, putting a roof on a house was something you could trade for. Just anything of value.
So what was the evolution to ultimately more of currencies, be those again, British, Dutch, Spanish, French, when were those introduced into the colonies, and what was then the evolution to ultimately, regular use of, and I assume predominant use of, British currency?
Mhm. Well, surprisingly, that happened very early. The introduction of it did. One of the things I do is I go read archaeological reports to see what has been found at very early sites. And one of the best documented is of course, Jamestown, James Fort in Jamestown. And if you go there and you read about what kind of coins and jetons, which were counting pieces that were used in commercial calculations, you read what kinds of things were found there, you will find coins from anywhere from England, Scotland, and Ireland that you would expect, to Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Latvia, Sweden. There are articles from all over the place, coins and tokens from all over the place, found there in significant numbers. Now, that doesn't mean those countries were sending people over to trade at Jamestown. It meant that the people who came were already commercially savvy and in need of coinage. So when you had a large group of people, like they're not large, but when you had a significant collection of people, you pretty soon transitioned to where trading fish and corn and musket balls was insufficient to do business. You needed some money. You needed some hard currency. Okay, so it began really early. Now, it's also important to understand that the British were very, very good at mercantilism. And I understand now it's more woke to say mercantilism. So old habits die hard. But anyway, of course, this was a system that encouraged you as a colonizing power, encouraged you as a world power to set up economic systems that brought gold and silver to your shores and didn't allow that gold and silver to leave. So consequently, if you were in the colonies, if you had a gold coin, it probably wasn't British. It was probably Portuguese or Spanish or a Louis d'Or from France, or even a Caroline from Germany. So the gold coins that were here were predominantly non-British. If you had a silver coin here, it was primarily from Spain. Is where those came from, and the Spanish colonies in South and Central America, because they were bringing billions of ounces of gold and silver out of there, and through trade in the West Indies, it ended up, in spite of efforts to the contrary, it ended up in North America. If you had a copper coin, then it probably was British. It was probably some version of a halfpenny or a farthing, which is another word for fourth penny, because the British didn't so much care that base metal coins, copper coins, came here. They wanted to keep the gold and silver to themselves, but they kind of looked the other way when it came to copper coins. They didn't make as much profit when they made copper coins as they did gold and silver. So they didn't object so much. Now, all that is to say, there were also coins eventually in time, after about 1652, there were coins that were made here. There's a plaque on the outside of the Macy's on Washington Street in Boston that's the site of the first mint in what's now the United States. John Hull made silver coins there. But all of those coins made in the United States amount to a very small part of the pie. It was mostly foreign coins that were intended for other countries that were used here originally. Even then, even with all these coins, probably 3/4 of the actual money in circulation was paper money. It wasn't coins at all. And then trade and barter was even bigger than paper money as a part of the economy. So I hope that kind of sets the landscape a little bit for.
Yeah. And so at what point was coinage and paper money minted and printed in the United States, in the colonies?
Well, coins, as I mentioned, were first minted here in 1652 in Boston, the New England coinage, silver coinage.
Okay, sorry, I've actually been past that Macy's. I'm not sure if I've seen that plaque, but okay. And was that currency that would have only been recognized here in the colonies, Or if you got on a ship and went to England, would you have been able to exchange that for?
Well, it was a little bit lighter than the official English coinage, so the intent was to keep it in Massachusetts, but it didn't work. Those coins ended up going all over the place. Went into Canada and they were exported to England and all over, which created a drain. You know, the silver actually left Massachusetts, but you know, and it was illegal. Technically, it was illegal for them to mint those coins, and so it was kind of an act of rebellion 125 years before the actual revolution. So it's kind of cool from that standpoint. They printed them, they minted them for about 30 years, and it was a very successful coinage. But eventually, as you mentioned, they actually left Massachusetts.
So was that a counterfeit or imitation of a British coin, or was that a uniquely Massachusetts Bay coin?
It was very much a Massachusetts Bay coin. It had a pine tree on the obverse of the head side,
right?
Which, as the pine tree stayed, I think that kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Eventually, they had a pine tree. They started out with just an NE, very simple for New England, and then those were easily counterfeited. Although no one has turned up a counterfeit, really, very many counterfeits of them. So they made it a little more complex, and they put what we've called a willow tree. Now, we don't know if it's a willow tree or not, but that's what it's traditionally been called. Those, over time, as the minting technology changed and the legislation changed, they became oak trees, or what we call oak trees, and then eventually they settled on pine trees. So it was very much a Massachusetts design. There's no parallel anywhere else.
And the value of that coin was just set through common exchange?
Well, they were issued as shillings, 6 pence, 3 pence, and later a 2 pence.
Okay.
So they had English denominations, and it was, the general court actually authorized them in those amounts. So they had some governmental authority, to produce them. All right. So there were other coinages that could be called token coinages that didn't have that kind of backing. I also wanted to mention Massachusetts also can take credit for the first paper money printed in the United States, and that was in 1690. And paper money then, as throughout the colonial period, was generally issued when there was a need to pay for something, in this case, King William's War, pay troops that fought in King William's War, when there was no coinage to pay those troops. So in each of the 4 French and Indian Wars, there were large issues of paper money to pay troops. There were also issues of paper money to pay for lighthouses and the Revolutionary War and other things as well.
I would assume that paper money, I mean, you mentioned the counterfeiting issue with respect to the coins. To what extent was counterfeiting an issue with the paper money, or simply multiple individuals or institutions just printing money and thereby devaluing the currency?
Well, yes, to both questions. There were, paper money, colonial paper money. We can talk about really 2 kinds of paper money: colonial and continental. The money that the colonies printed was generally used in that colony and maybe a couple of colonies on either side of it. They had a kind of a local circulation, and most of them initially held up pretty well value-wise. Most of them had some degree of redeemability. They would pay interest. A bill of credit was actually a form of credit. You extended credit to the colony by honoring this bill. And in the future, there was an IOU, a promise that you would be able to redeem that, often at interest. So they actually held up pretty well. Now, over time, that they did decline in value from that overprinting. And we were even referred to by a German author as the paper colonies because we printed so much paper money. But counterfeiting was a problem really from almost from the beginning, it usually took the form not of printing a fake bill, but of taking an existing one and marking the value up, something like that. So you take a 10 shilling bill and you make it a 20 shilling bill. All right. And there were lots of cases of that. Now, during the Revolutionary War, when we were printing Continental currency, which in theory could be used anywhere on the continent, the British were actively counterfeiting that bill to subvert our economy. And they were recruiting, they had ships anchored in New York Harbor printing the money, and they were putting ads in the paper saying, loyalists, come pick up a few reams of this fake money and spread it around for us.
Fascinating. Now, just before this, when we were working through some technical difficulties that we ultimately could not solve, Carrie and I were talking about this, and isn't there some phrase, not worth a Continental or something like that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, part of that came about because of British counterfeiting. We issued Continental Currency really on May 10th, 1775 was the first authorization of it. And that was when we invaded Fort Ticonderoga, and we, voted on, we were beginning to talk about, for lack of a better word, secession, rebellion. So it's very early, and it continued for about 4 years. And initially, before counterfeiting took hold and before people lost confidence in the money, it held its value for a little while. And then it began to decline pretty steeply. And, there was a point where $40 in Continental currency could be exchanged for $1 in hard currency. And it went down from there even.
So now, again, who authorized printing the Continentals?
Congress.
Okay.
Congress did.
And did they contract with different printers to then do the printing?
Actually, there was, it's fascinating. The Continental Congress exclusively used the firm of David Hall's firm. And David Hall had been, Hall and Sellers, that is. David Hall had been a partner of Benjamin Franklin earlier. And Franklin, when he retired, sold his business to Hall. And Franklin still, I believe, received some compensation even after he sold the business. But it was basically a friend of a friend that they contracted with to do this. Now, what's really neat is if you look at some of the colonial notes from earlier, Ben Franklin himself printed, and with David Hall, printed money for Delaware and Pennsylvania, and Paul Revere printed money for Massachusetts. And some of those are really highly desirable notes, obviously.
I can imagine that. Isn't that why the plate that the engraving of Revere's depiction of the Boston Massacre, isn't that why that survives? Because on the back of it is currency. Does that ring a bell?
That is extremely possible. I know that some of the sword in hand note plates survive. I'm not sure whether that's what's on the back of the Boston Massacre engraving or not. That's a good thing. I'll make a note of that and research it. I don't know.
I think there was some discussion that was essentially like the only reason that this plate exists is because of what was on the back of it. Mm-hmm. But I'm not certain. So
very good possibility.
So the Continentals then were printed in what, Philadelphia, I assume?
Yes.
And then they were distributed throughout the colonies?
To the extent possible, yes. There were, there was actually one issue. Most of them were authored. There were 11 different distinct authorizations, 37 issues, I believe, but 11 distinct authorizations, 11 different dates. One of those was when Congress was meeting in York, Pennsylvania. They authorized it. So the bill actually says York on it. They're called Yorktown notes. Another issue was authorized in Baltimore, and so it says Baltimore on the note. The rest were authorized in Philadelphia, but they were all printed in Philadelphia.
Got it. So I want to get back to the history, but I'm curious. Talk to us a little bit about how you became interested in this, and again, just an amazing amount of information you've researched and compiled and so forth. Really a huge undertaking, surely. And tell us a little bit. Are you also a collector?
Yeah, I am. And to answer your question, I'm not sure how I became interested in it because I was about 4 years old at the time. So, and that was a very long time ago. So I don't really know. And I should have given you a disclaimer. I am not an academic. I'm not a historian. I am a hobbyist. And I just became captivated by this period in our history.
You know what? We designed History Camp to bring together people who have a passion for a topic and have spent years and years investigating that topic. So one of the beauties of History Camp is everyone is welcome, and certainly folks who wish to present. There is no academic litmus test or a credential, profession, anything like that. This is a fabulous example of why that's the case, right? So how on earth did you go about compiling again what I would assume is probably this is the Bible of
No.
Oh, okay.
No. The real Bible was written in 1875 by a fellow named Sylvester Crosby.
Well, he was a little more recent to the actual event, so you'd have had a leg up on.
Yeah, but he did a wonderful job. Coins of Early America, written in 1875. The paper money reference, in my book is by no means a reference, but the paper money, Eric Newman wrote that. And he, to honor Crosby's book on coins, he called it the early paper money of America. And that is considered the Bible. Now, there are some other books by Q. David Bowers and others who have kind of superseded Crosby, but Crosby's still relevant all these years later, which is just incredible. In my mind, nearly 150 years later, Crosby's still just as relevant as it was then. So in my mind, that makes it a classic. In terms of what I did, I originally was going to do a website and just sort of use my collection to illustrate, this historical narrative. And then I realized that the University of Notre Dame has a very good website, and I'd encourage everybody to go out and look at it, that Dr. Lou Jordan maintains, that has their collection, has lots of good material on it. And so I'd already written a lot of stuff to go on the webpage, and then decided not to use it because I could never keep up with them. So I decided to then turn it into a book to give. I have 4 daughters, and it was designed to give them some legacy to help them understand why Dad's crazy about these things.
Fabulous.
So that was it. At the time I was traveling a lot in my job, and so I would work on it in the hotel rooms and the airplanes and that kind of thing. So it took 10 years. So
well, it's just fascinating. Now, one of the things we do want to mention, this book is not widely available, and that's maybe even an overstatement at that. So we're going to make it available through the History Camp Online site. So by late Thursday night, we should have a link up so that if people are interested in your book, and it's let's see, 568 or something pages. Probably more. Do I have that? Am I close?
That's pretty close, yeah.
And just loaded with photographs and so forth. But we'll have a link up where people can buy that, and then you will sign and send out a copy, I believe.
Sure.
So that would be great.
So
what was your kind of the scope of your study of early American currency and the kind of the focus of your book as opposed to perhaps some of the other ones that you're referring to?
Well, traditionally, when people collected coins from this period or studied coins from this period. If you go back maybe 25 or 30 years, there was a real tendency to focus on one state or one colony. And I should say that most of the, these have traditionally been called colonial coins, when you're talking about coins. And yet most of the things that were called colonial were actually issued under the Articles of Confederation when we were no longer colonies. So it was a little bit that's why I choose not to use the word colonial, in referring to these. But most people who studied these would focus on one series, for example, New Jersey coinage or Connecticut coinage or Vermont coinage or so on. And one of the things I wanted to do is sort of give an overview, maybe high level, maybe not real deep, but an overview of all those coinages, Massachusetts as well, and an overview of the paper money. So it's not for the serious collector maybe, but maybe it's a good introduction to it. And that's one focus. And then the other was I realized that these American coins were really a small part of the picture, that there were a lot of other coins, and Eric Newman and others have said that for decades before I was born. But a lot of the books out there seem to kind of ignore the fact that we had Dutch and French and German and Spanish and Swedish. We even had New Sweden here. They just seem to ignore that. And so I wanted to kind of broaden that and include trade items as well. So the scope just kept getting bigger, and mercifully it is only 500 and something pages. It started out being 1,500 pages.
I'm amazed. So I want to talk. I want to get back to the history in just a minute, but let's talk a little more about then your passion for collecting. If someone was watching this and said, "This is fascinating. I'm intrigued." What kinds of things are out there that might be of interest for someone who would be starting out collecting? Yeah. And that that would be affordable?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lee. And one of the neat things about this hobby is that there really is something for everybody out there. If you have $15 or $20 to spend, you can go find on eBay or at a reputable dealer. You can find a counterfeit British halfpence or a regal legitimate British halfpence that made up the bulk of the coins that circulated in America. And you can find a fairly decent one that has all the details for $15, $20. Okay. If you have, say, $50 to $100 to spend, you can go find a Colonial note, piece of paper money, or a Continental. Now, it may be ragged, may not look like much, but it'll be something that was used back in the 1770s, by folks in the Revolutionary War. If you have $300 or $400 to spend, you can start looking at, some of the better condition or state coinages that were issued. If you have $1,000 or more to spend, I would recommend buying a Massachusetts pine tree coin, just because of what they represent. The spirit of it. So there's something for everybody really in this.
Fascinating. Now, Will, you are also a part of at least one organization?
Yes.
And what's the name of that?
It's called the Colonial Coin Collectors Club. And I would be severely beaten about the head and shoulders if I didn't mention that.
Yes.
If you go out to colonialcoins.org, they have a great website, and it's got a lot of listing of publications that are very good by topic. The club has a newsletter that goes out once a quarter. It's very good too. So I would recommend that.
You sent me a copy of the newsletter. Very impressive. It just packed with information. That is great. And then one other question along these lines, and then we'll go back to the history. Is there let's look ahead to when we're meeting in person again. Is there an annual event, a conference, a convention, or something?
Yes, and let me throw out one more thing, Lee. I apologize for this, but Eric Newman, the gentleman I mentioned, researcher, passed away a few years ago at the age of 106. Right. Wow. Well, part of his legacy was this wonderful data-driven website called the Newman Numismatic Portal, And I don't know off the top of my head the address, but you can certainly Google that and find it's searchable. It's got a lot of great information about it. Okay.
Great.
The club that I mentioned is a national organization. We meet in Baltimore, usually around the second week of November.
Mm-hmm.
That isn't going to happen this year. We're going to have a virtual convention for reasons that we all understand, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a very good organization. People from all levels of collecting and study, and it's as much about the fellowship as anything else.
Sure.
Not so much about the material aspect of.
One of the things that we'll do after this, if we can get you to send a note to us with, some of those links, some of those resources, we'll add those to the description.
Okay,
that would be great. All right, so we're at a point where the Continental Congress is authorizing the printing of Continentals, and talk to us then how we go forward ultimately to currency that we're more used to today. What's the evolution that ultimately gets us to a more modern day currency?
Well, that's another very good question. There was a plan. Well, first off, the devaluation of continental currency left a really bad taste in a lot of people's mouths for paper currency. It took really decades until people finally started accepting paper currency as legitimate again. There were wildcat banks who issued unbacked currency in the 1820s and 30s, and those crashed and left another bad taste in people's mouth. So it wasn't until 1862 that the federal government, nearly the Civil War, well, after the start of the Civil War, that the federal government finally stabilized, the printing of paper currency. So it took a long time for paper currency. There was a plan devised by Gouverneur Morris in the early 1780s. At the time we had, even if you were using English currency, there were about 5 or 6 different versions of that in America. So in other words, a Pennsylvania shilling wasn't the same as a South Carolina shilling. New York shilling wasn't the same as a Georgia shilling. So there were all these different currencies. Gouverneur Morris devised a very complex but very elegant. He was a child of the Enlightenment, right? So a very elegant system that mathematically linked all of those currencies together. All right, and it was based on the idea of a quarter of a grain of silver being the unit. So you had 1,000 unit piece, a 500 unit piece, a 100 unit piece, and it meant some pretty complicated math, to keep up with. And Thomas Jefferson kind of looked at it and said, no, the Spanish, they use twos, and everybody can can do math with tens. So let's just use twos and tens, and let's pick up the Spanish dollar and do a half dollar, quarter dollar, an eighth dollar, which a bit. And so that's how we kind of ended up with that system. But even then, that was 1782 or 83. Robert Morris, the chief financier of the Confederation, sponsored that system. He wanted to do that. He had patterns minted, to show everybody what these would look like. And yet that was ultimately defeated. We never did that. So from 1783 or so until 1793, when the U.S. Mint was actually begun, Mint Act was 1792, and then the Mint was built the next year. So it took 10 years for us to actually begin minting a federal coinage. Now, Congress authorized a coin called the Fugio cent in 1787, and it was contracted out to private parties to mint. And there were a number of them minted, quite a few of them minted, but that wasn't really the federal government minting. It took till 1793 to get a mint. Even then, the mint was underfunded, understaffed. Every summer, it was decimated by yellow fever epidemics in Philadelphia. And so they really couldn't meet public demand. They couldn't get metal to make dies or to mint the coins on. So they really struggled for a number of years. And I don't think that really cleared up until 1836, when the mint got a German steam press. And the designs changed. They became more products of industry than handcrafted things. So I really think, 1836 to 1840 was when it ultimately became what we know now, something resembling what we know now.
That is fascinating. So the house we have is dates to 1780, and I've gone
Wow.
to the courthouse, looked at the records, and in those, handwritten, of course, I saw transactions referencing what I think of as British units of currency.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was assuming, and this because I just knew nothing about currency in that period, I just assumed, well, they're using British currency, but instead they may very well have been using currency printed here or minted here, but they were using the names. They continued the convention. Is that correct in terms of the naming of the units?
Well, they still used, the Continental currency was actually denominated in dollars.
Okay.
And it was redeemable in Spanish dollars, because there were no American dollars. We really didn't have eagles and dollars and cents until the Mint Act of 1792. That's when it really established it. Now, Massachusetts in 1787 did issue cents, the first cents. But still, we didn't have our current system until the Mint Act of 1792. And even into the early 19th century, you will see references to pounds, shillings, and pence in America.
And again, would that have been currency printed or minted in England, or was those names attached to currency minted or printed here in the States?
Well, that's kind of a little bit of a complicated question. Generally, I think it refers more to English.
Okay.
English pieces. I don't think there would have been very little, if any, minted or printed here in the United States that late.
Okay.
That would have referred to pounds, shillings, and pence. But what's interesting, you will see sometimes. See, we set up a trimetallic system: gold eagles, silver dollars, and copper cents. And you will sometimes, an eagle was $10 in gold. So you'll see sometimes prices written as number of eagles with a period, number of dollars with a period, and number of cents with a period. And that emulates that British pounds, shillings, and pence. So you still do see that.
So we've had a few questions from some of the folks who are viewing it. How did the value of foreign coins get set? And I assume here a reference to when they were being used here in America.
Yeah, well, it kind of raises an interesting topic of what it was like to be a merchant, in these times. And it was really complicated. You had to be very, very good at arithmetic or math, because you would have had a table that usually came in the form of an almanac, or you purchased a broadside that had that on it, that said this French currency translates to this in Portuguese currency, and you would have had to do the math to do that. And you also had to be cognizant of the purity of the coin. Was it 70% gold or was it 90% gold? And you had to factor that into your calculations. You had to weigh it to make sure it wasn't fake or that it hadn't been shaved, to remove gold. You had to be pretty smart to be a merchant. I think, and that boded well for the people who made balance scales, and for the people who made printed almanacs too, because it really was complicated. I have a friend who collects almanacs, and he gives a fascinating lecture on where he goes through an example if someone comes in and buys something and they pay for it with 4 different kinds of currency. And what is that like for the merchant?
Well, it sounds like that. It sounds like you should encourage him to reach out and
Yeah,
maybe a future talk. Another question: how interchangeable were these? And I think you may have just kind of answered that question. So someone might come in with French currency, Spanish currency, and they might have gotten change back in British currency, for example. Is that correct?
right.
Okay.
Or some combination thereof, and if if there was not a whole coin that would suffice to give change, it might be a cut piece of a coin that was given out in change. That was fairly common. I have a big pair of shears. It's just huge. And when I give talks to our local coin clubs, I like to take a silver dollar and cut it up and give out pieces to the kids, because that's how they used to do it.
Is it pieces of 8? Is that a reference to?
A piece of 8 is a 8 reals Spanish dollar, which is ultimately the origin of our dollar and maybe even the origin of our dollar sign. That's another topic for another day. But you would cut those in halves, quarters, eighths, and an eighth was a bit. But it was a piece of value 8 reals is what piece of 8 means. And you could cut it in 16ths as well. That was a picayune. It was a 16th.
Really. Well, I'm delighted, and I don't quite remember how our email. I think I do, but I'm not quite sure. I remember how our email exchange started. But I'm so glad we did, and it was so nice of you to send this book. And when I got it, I immediately told Carrie, and I sent her a picture. I'm like, we have got to have Will educate us about early colonial currencies. And it's so nice of you to spend the time with us this evening. And we really hope that you will join us at one or more of our history camps. We're optimistic that those are going to take place next year. Right now, we anticipate that the earliest would be July, and that would be here in Boston. And in addition, again, if all goes well, we'll also have history camps in Philadelphia, in Richmond, in Littleton, just outside of Denver, and of course there'll also be history camps in Des Moines and in Holyoke. And just had a note the other day that the folks who organized the one in Des Moines are looking potentially this fall at an online event. So this is great. Next week, a lady named Maureen Taylor is going to join us. She has a fascinating background and is known as the photo detective. And so people, among the many things she's done, people may say, I've got a photograph. How do I track down the time period, the individuals, and so forth? And I believe Maureen is also the person who was one of the driving forces, or perhaps the driving force, behind an exhibit that brought together photographs of Revolutionary era soldiers, which is really just a fascinating thing to think about, right? You don't. It seems like how was their photography? How was there that overlap and so forth? Needless to say, the gentlemen were fairly old by the time they sat for a photograph. But this has been great. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you. So you've got a fascinating background. It's almost like we're talking with you from a museum. Tell us what we see behind you.
Well, this is my dingy little office. If you could see that side, you'd see a bunch of lamps, to give enough light. But this is my dingy little office, and you'll see over here a picture of Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington that came out of an old schoolhouse in the county where I live. Immediately behind me is a chart of currencies used around the world that was printed in about 1770. So it shows all the different countries and what their currencies were. This is a reproduction of a map This is the picture at the top here is St. Eustatius. It's also a reproduction, but I would encourage your listeners to go do a little research on St. Eustatius. It's a little Dutch island in the Caribbean where most of the supplies that supported America during the Revolution came through illicit trade through St. Eustatius. Fascinating place. There's a musket from about 1775 that you probably can't see. You probably see the powder horn, I think, of it. There's a 1755 French map of North America that's not a reproduction. It's the Donville map over here that I'm kind of proud of. There's just a lot of stuff, you know.
Well, it sounds fabulous. We need to have a tour sometime. Yeah. We've actually talked about doing something that would make it possible for people to share some insight on their collections, because so many of the people that are you know, speakers either at History Camp or History Camp Online and so forth have fabulous collections too. Yeah. So, well, this is great. I think we might have lost or have a slight hang up on the connection there.
Probably can't see real well, but it's from about.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Say that again, please.
I just said a couple more things. There's a table here from about 1630. It's a Spanish colonial table and some old bottles and stuff. So just a lot of junk, you know.
Well, that all sounds fascinating. So thank you very much, Will. We will get this. We'll get those links from you. We'll add those. We will get this uploaded to our History Camp Online site, which is historycamp.org/online. And late tonight, and we will add also the links to purchase your book. We may be I think the exclusive online provider of that for at least for a while here. And we really appreciate your being able to accommodate people who were interested in your book and enabling them to buy that online. So Will, thanks so much. This has been great fun. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lee. It's been a real honor. Thank you.
And next week, Carrie will be back with us. So take care. We'll see you next week.
Good night.